Russia and Russian societies played a key role in shaping the modern Western world. But there's a question why Russian society has seemingly been isolated and what makes it different from Western countries. Now, I think it's safe to say that Russian society is generally more collectivist in nature compared to the West, but not in the way Western society sees collectivism. For collectivism in Russia has synonyms for the mir, and that's the unit. And I'm going to be referencing this paper, and I'll just give a quick quotation. Mir, in fact, has three meanings: village, commune, world, and peace. And for its members, it symbolized all three. Well, what is the mir? We'll get into that later. But for now, I'm going to be referencing throughout this video the paper Russian Collectivism, An Invisible Fist and the Transformation Process of Russia by who I'm going to refer to as the professor throughout this video because I don't want to butcher his name. And this discusses the effects of the Russian collectivist system value, which I'm just going to call general Russian collectivism or deviation of that. And well, to understand why Russian society is more collectivist than other typical Western countries, we got to go back to the village life. Originating in the Kievan state in the 9th century, of course, Kiev was a birthplace for many of the Rus people. And of course, we know that the Rus people birthed the modern-day Russians. And so they existed in society in an office under a prince. But what's really important to know is, well, what was the nature of the environment? Well, of course, Russia has a stereotype of being very cold, and the Kievan state was not a lot different. It was extremely cold, so when you have cold, well, you're not allowed to have a lot of individualization because you have to work as a collective, because with great deviancy, well, the elements will just literally end your society. So you got to be careful with that, and that's one point why Russia is more collectivist. And of course, well, when you have this system of governments, it's going to rely quite heavily on communitarianism, but it also breeds this degree of centralization, which may seem incompatible, but when you look further, in a desolate environment, centralism is somewhat necessary to suppress individualistic freedoms and expressions because, well, if someone's saying, well, I have a better way of doing things, well, maybe they do, but do you have the opportunity to take that chance? Well, likely not. So that's why you had to listen. You had to listen to the centralization, and you had to work together because the cold is so harming back then. Simply put, when there's more conflict, there's less ability to form individualism. And so we see this Russian collectivism was first sowed in the minds of the villagers, because if they disobeyed, well, they likely will die to the cold or something of the sorts. Now, we also can understand the reluctance for individualism. When you look at the modern Russian state, well, it had a history of conflict. You have the Mongols to the east, the Lithuanian Poles from the west, well, around there, and the cold coming from everywhere. So simply put, when you have a lot of conflict, well, there's less ability to foster individualism. But you may be asking, well, war and weather aren't unique to Russia or the Kievan state, so what cemented this idea? Well, we also have to understand the cultural and geographical divide showcasing why Russian had become more collectivist. The Russians, well, not only being literally geographically isolated from the rest of Europe on the east, the Russians also had a cultural distance. Of course, I'm talking about the introduction of Orthodox Christianity. Well, okay, we didn't have the East-West Schism, but then they did. And so when Russia eventually formed into Russian Orthodox as a state religion, well, now you have another split. You're split from the church from the West. So you're not only geographically split, you're also religiously split and culturally split. So, of course, when the fall of Constantinople happened, well, the Eastern Roman Empire caused this carve of an island from mainland Europe, and, well, you don't have the same technological or cultural ropes, and so those ropes are tied off. And we have this idea, the idea of sobernost, And this is the communal spirit of the Russians. And of course, it's isolating themselves from more individualistic Western Europe. That's the idea. So we understand, okay, there's a cultural divide, there's a geographical divide, there's an environmental divide, there's that war divide. Well, it's coming to form a basis why there's Russian collectivism. And so it's back to the Kievan state. So, like I said earlier, the Kievan state, they lived in the cold. It, frankly, wasn't very areable. And the springs would cause a terrible thaw. And, well, it left for a short time to be productive. There's that stereotype of the Russian farming. He has to farm, and then whatever he stereotype drink vodka or whatever. There is some truth because there's not a lot of time to do farming. You have to get it done quickly, and you're left to deal with the cold for the rest of the year. So in order for the society to survive, you had to make that great progress in the summer, and if they did not, well, of course, starvation is not foreign to many societies. But you also have to defend yourself from invaders, you gotta till the land, and you gotta farm the fields. And there's also the fact that, well, it may seem like a comical trope, the Russian bear and the Russian man have this relationship. It's not false. The bear was the king of the forest, and so the Russians also had to be wary of that. So now we see, well, Russian life wasn't necessarily easy. I mean, no life was easy. But you see why the Russians had grown more to be collectivist. And there's this proverb that goes, together in the mirror, we will move even mountains. So you can see the general feeling towards the group community. You're able to do a lot as a group. And maybe you're thinking, oh, you can project this to modern Russia. Well, of course, it is part of their inherent culture. So by forming a group, they were actually able to create something livable. And so the mir was the typical way the Russian peasant lived, in this communal way of living. And so most of the cultural and structural components of the Kievan state, it bled into the Muscovite state. The mir made the decisions as a community, the land was owned communally, and so the Russian collectivist mindset continued. The objective, of course, of the mir was stability, of course, and to maintain a balance. If there was a problem, well, the whole community would come together to form a council, and then they'd hold until a consensus was reached. But of course, we know that the mir could not last forever, and the rule of the Tsar came. And under the Tsar, the land was not owned by a mir, but rather a landlord. And now it may seem that the people of the mir would hold the Tsar with contempt, but rather the Tsar was a kind of check and balance to the landlord. And this kind of comes back to the components of the Russian collectivist mindset. You have that centralistic component. You have, of course, the Tsar. He's making the decisions, and you have that communitarianism. Well, they're working together. They're under the landlord. They're still farming together. And you can kind of see this east-west schism perfectly imbued in the creation of the Trans-Siberian highway, or railway, I should say. And it was a way, the political means was they wanted to bring the Siberian area back to the reigns of Moscow, because they're so isolated that the centralization of Moscow, well, it couldn't do that. And so you see the political reasoning why the Trans-Siberian Railway was created, and this was during the time of the Tsar. And you see that, well, it was not only for the political means or the economic means. Well, it was quite political in terms of you want to bring back Russia's control of Siberia, and it wasn't only a capitalistic enterprise. And you see it in the way they developed it. It was extremely costly, not only in manpower and money, but just to the whole community. So you see this, and it's quite a lengthy thing. It's a staple of the centralization, I would say. And there's a great video, I'll link it below, by IMPERIAL. Now, in this period, as mentioned in the paper, there were some who became kulaks, and of course we know the kulaks as the owners of wealth, and it would seem they would shed the values of the collective. But of course, the professor, he makes the argument that, While there might be some truth in this, the fact remains that the basic fiber of RCVS continued to inspire and to strengthen peasants throughout the periods that preceded and followed the abolition of serfdom. They thus managed to assert their basic interests and, for the most part, to survive. Now we see this, and there was extreme growth in this Russian part of history. It was one of the biggest economies in Europe and the world, actually. We also see Russian collectivism in the way that the Russian workers had lived and worked, and this is called the artel. Now, the artel was an association in which the workers would elect a leader and work communally. They would live in communal apartments, they would eat together in these apartments, they would share the rent, and they would dine together and even go out in social events. And I think we could likely see this influence in the Soviet architecture, where you have these great communal blocks where a whole bunch of people are living together. I would say it's quite fair to think that some of that is in part to the Russian artel. And so, the professor puts it great, in a culture that values harmony of thought and the communal good, persons who differ from the established order are suspect. Individualists, which has a negative meaning in Russia, appear opposed to the sense of community as a basis for social good. So you see, the individualist is someone who's going against the community. And it's not so much that they're a villain, it's just that, well, there's a certain good that you do as a group, and if you go against it, well, maybe you're doing it maliciously. However, I don't think it's entirely negative. But now we come out of the era of the Tsar, and of course they skip past the Russian government style of the West, and we go into the Soviet era of Russia. Now, Lenin noted that it would be quite necessary to incorporate the Russian collectivist mindset into the new governance of Russia, and so the idea of the Russian worker would be an important part in changing how these enterprises works, because the worker had a lot of power as the community, in the community. And so the idea was that the Russian workers, from the top to the bottom, they were equally necessary in making decisions, and they were equally represented in ownership. We see this in the various committees involving the workers of Soviet governance, like the plant committees, which grew into the WRC, or worker collectives. Now, the Soviets' way of governance was put as democratic centralism, and this was an attempt to promote the grassroots participation that the Russian collectivist mindset is imbued in. Because remember, the group would always make a decision in the mirror. You would come together and you'd hold a council. So that's why you see this equal distribution of control. And so democratic centralism was defined as, number one, the application of the elective principle to all leading organs of the party, from the highest to the lowest. So again, each person is equal. Each person has some control. Number two, periodic accountability of party organs to the respective party organization, so you'd see to be held accountable for their actions. They'd visit and see what they're doing. Number three, strict party discipline and the subordination of the minority to the majority. That's that sort of centralism from the individual to the greater party. Number four, the absolute binding character of the decisions of the higher organs upon the lower organs and upon party members. So you see, it's that centralistic idea where it's democratic, but it's centralist, so they make the decisions and they all agree. But it didn't really work, and so most decision making was a top-down way, and Lenin created a one-man leadership position, a way for different organizations to have a head of leadership, similar to the Tsarist ways that were before. This way of one-man leadership in various institutions was not seen as undemocratic from below, and as stated by the professor. However, one-man leadership was not conceived as a suppression of democratic control from below. It was claimed in 1929 and 1930 that one-man leadership at the same time granted enormous powers to management and also required several fold multiplied control from below in order to prevent unlimited managerial despotism. And so, yeah, of course, the bottom also has to agree. And so you have this "you're only in control because we allow it" type idea. And again, another quotation: an engineer from Sverdlovsk advocated the right of the collective to dismiss unethical or unprincipled managers. One-man leadership, he argued, by no means excludes obligation before the collective and full responsibility for deeds and actions. So this way of governments, which was not entirely democratic nor entirely autocratic, but a blend that the Soviets crafted. So we have this new regime that the political leadership sought to create in the factories. And so I have another quote. Thus, the new regime that the political leadership sought to create in factories was characterized by a peculiar combination of sole managerial command and multiple controls over management, and therefore was perhaps neither despotic, as Western scholars would have us to believe, nor democratic, as Soviet scholars claimed. Conceptual ambiguities implicit in control constantly created tensions between dictatorship and democracy, and between the needs for discipline on the one hand and for grassroots mobilization on the other. So you have this centralization, but you also want this grassroots participation. It's the collective, but the collective needs to participate in order for it to be viable. So we can see these various implications of the Russian collectivist mindset. While in like war, for example, you see a lot of the soldiers are used. The Russians would use a lot of soldiers to achieve something because it's for the collective. It's a lot less individualistic like the West. And well, there's a few examples I gave in the Soviet era. It's far from the many different ways it was implemented in the Soviet governance. But now we come to the Russian society in modern times. Does the rise of a more globalized thought process through the internet and just global trade and communication, well, how does the Russian mindset, the Russian collectivist mindset, persist? Does it persist? How do these traditions merge with the present? While I've linked a paper below, and there's many different writings on individualism and the collective in Russia, I'd like to leave it with you, especially with our modern times now. What is the future of the Russian collectivist mindset? Do you see it persisting? Well, it's hard for me to say, and we'll just have to wait and see. I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you believe that the Russian collectivist mindset still exists in modern Russia? If you have any comments or critiques, let me know. And if you enjoyed, give it a sub, will you?